Friends, before you is the legendary silhouette in the sky over the English Channel, which is widely considered a defining weapon of victory. The British Supermarine Spitfire is an iconic fighter, but behind its grand reputation lay dangerous engineering flaws. Why did this machine's state-of-the-art armament fail at crucial moments, leaving pilots completely defenseless at an altitude of 10 kilometers? How did a fragile racing float plane transform into the Luftwaffe's primary nightmare, despite the doubts of ministry officials? Today, we will look behind the scenes of this story. You will discover design secrets that were kept quiet for a long time, and a detailed analysis of the critical day that changed the course of the aerial confrontation. I recommend watching until the end. You will learn about the technological drama that unfolded in the factories and the hidden engineering miscalculation that nearly gave absolute dominance in the skies to German aces. Let's begin. The year is 1931. Reginald Mitchell sits in his office chair in Southampton, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Outside the window is a gray English sky. He has just returned from the doctor. The diagnosis was rectal cancer. The surgery had been successful, but the doctors spoke cautiously, choosing their words carefully. Mitchell was an engineer. He knew how to read between the lines of technical reports, and he could read between the lines of medical prognoses as well. Time was short. He was 46 years old. Behind him were victories in international racing competitions, speed records, and a reputation as Britain's finest aircraft designer. Ahead lay a blank sheet of paper and an idea that would not let him rest. Mitchell understood one thing that few appreciated at the time. Europe was changing, and not for the better. He read the newspapers, he spoke to people who had visited Germany, and he knew that what was looming from the east was not politics, it was physics. It was a collision that would have speed, altitude, and firepower. Britain needed a plane, not the kind currently in service, but something different. In 1933, Mitchell visited Germany and personally observed demonstration flights of the new German machines. When he returned, his colleagues noticed a change in him. He became tougher, worked longer hours, and almost stopped going home on time. When asked why, his answer was brief: "We have no time." He began to design. First came a prototype called Type 224, angular, with distinctive wing bends and an open cockpit. Mitchell submitted it for trials in 1934. The aircraft flew, but the designer looked at it and shook his head. It was not right. The Air Ministry accepted the machine without much enthusiasm. Its technical characteristics were average, and its speed was insufficient. Mitchell understood this himself. He was already thinking about the next step. And this is where a rarely told story begins. Supermarine, the company where Mitchell worked, received private funding to develop a new fighter. This was not a government contract, but private money, which meant no committees and no bureaucratic approvals. Mitchell could build what he believed was right. He assembled a small team and set one condition: no rushing for reports, only quality. He began working on a machine that would later be named the Spitfire. Mitchell himself, according to his colleagues, did not like the name. "A silly name for a beautiful aircraft," he said when he first heard it. Work progressed as quickly as possible for a fundamentally new machine. Mitchell arrived at the factory before everyone else and left last. In 1936, his illness relapsed, leading to another operation, another hospital stay, and another recovery. Then, back to the factory. Colleagues recalled that during periods when the pain was particularly severe, he would simply sit and draw, blueprint after blueprint, component after component, as if time stood still as long as his pencil moved across the paper. On March 5, 1936, the prototype took to the air for the first time over Eastleigh Aerodrome. At the controls was test pilot Joseph "Mutt" Summers. Mitchell stood on the airfield watching the sky. What he felt at that moment, no one knew. He did not speak of it. The aircraft returned. Summers taxied to the stand, shut down the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. He walked up to Mitchell and said only, "Don't change a thing." This was the highest praise from a man who had flown hundreds of aircraft. Mitchell nodded. But changes, of course, had to be made. That is always the case. Yet the foundation, the very foundation he conceived in 1931, while staring at a blank sheet of paper after returning from the doctor, remained untouched. In June 1937, Reginald Joseph Mitchell passed away. He was 42 years old. His aircraft was only just undergoing service trials, a year away from being officially commissioned and 3 years away from its major battles. He did not see a single one of them, yet it was he who determined their outcome. There is one fact that many overlook when talking about the Spitfire. This aircraft is a direct descendant of racing machines, not just in spirit or metaphorically, but literally and structurally. To understand this, one must know about the Schneider trophy. In the early 20th century, there was a competition officially known as the Jacques Schneider Maritime Aviation Cup. In 1911, French industrialist Jacques Schneider established a prize for the fastest overwater flight in a float plane. The idea was simple: to develop naval aviation through honest competition. It turned into something much greater. The Schneider Cup became the premier technical race of its time. It was not just a competition between pilots, but between engineering schools. Britain against Italy, Italy against the United States. Every 2 years brought a new record, and each record pushed the boundaries of the possible. Mitchell entered this arena in 1922. Supermarine tasked him with preparing a machine for the next running of the Cup. He was young and had almost no experience in racing design, but he possessed something else: the ability to think not from tradition, but from the task at hand. The task was simple: fly faster than anyone else. His first attempts were modest. Mitchell's machines competed but did not win. He lost, studied the winners, and returned to the drawing board. Each time, his next aircraft was noticeably better than the last. By 1927, Mitchell had created the S5. It featured a narrow, almost needle-like fuselage with floats pressed so closely to the body they seemed part of it, and a powerful 875 horsepower Napier Lion engine. British pilot Flight Lieutenant Sidney Webster won the Schneider Cup in this machine, achieving an average speed of 453 kilometers per hour. Mitchell looked at the figures, nodded, and began the next project. In 1929, the S6 appeared, now powered by the Rolls-Royce R engine, producing nearly 1,900 horsepower. The machine was so powerful that it created a serious problem. The engine's torque literally pulled the plane to one side during its takeoff run on the water. Mitchell solved this cunningly by making the floats different sizes to compensate for the torque through unequal hydrodynamic drag. This is a detail few notice, but it is precisely such details that separate a good engineer from a great one. The S6 won the Cup and set a world speed record for aircraft at 575 kilometers per hour. Then, something important occurred. In 1931, the British government refused to fund participation in the next running of the Cup, citing money, budgets, and the financial crisis. It seemed that was the end, and the Cup, along with leadership in aviation technology, would go to someone else. It was then that Lady Lucy Houston stepped in. A wealthy widow, philanthropist, and woman of strong character, she wrote a check for £100,000 from her personal funds, a colossal sum at the time, roughly equivalent to the cost of building a small warship. "I will not allow Britain to lose for want of money," she said. Mitchell received the funding and created the S.6B. What happened next was almost unbelievable. In September 1931, British pilot John Boothman flew the S-6B over the Solent at an average speed of 655 kilometers per hour. This was a float plane, taking off from water, and it flew faster than any other aircraft on the planet, faster than any fighter, faster than any bomber, faster than anything else in the air. The Schneider Cup was won for the third consecutive time, meaning that under the rules of the competition, the trophy remained with Britain forever. But by then, Mitchell was no longer thinking about trophies. He was thinking about how the Rolls-Royce R engine used in the S-6B could, with refinement, become the basis for an entirely different kind of machine, not a racing plane, but a combat one. This engine would later evolve into the Merlin, the very heart that would beat inside the Spitfire. He was also thinking about aerodynamics, about how water flowed around floats at extreme speeds, and how air behaved at high altitudes. Racing over the sea had taught him one thing. At speeds where real problems begin, it is not the one with the most powerful engine who wins, but the one with the superior shape. Shape meant the wing. And here we arrive at the primary legacy of the racing era. The experience of designing machines that had to extract the absolute maximum from every square centimeter of lifting surface led Mitchell to an idea that initially seemed strange to his colleagues: the elliptical wing. Not straight like most planes of the time, nor swept. but elliptical, with a characteristic rounded contour tapering toward the tips along a curve. Aerodynamically, this was almost the perfect shape, offering the lowest induced drag for a given area, meaning the aircraft lost less speed than it otherwise would. In theory, everyone knew this, but before Mitchell, no one had risked putting such a wing on a mass-produced combat aircraft. It was too complex to manufacture, too expensive, and carried too much risk. Mitchell did it anyway. He knew that sometimes the right decision is the very one everyone else has rejected for the sake of convenience. Racing over water had taught him not to fear complex solutions, to account for every kilogram and square centimeter, and that the difference between victory and defeat is measured in details most people never notice. He built these lessons entirely into the new aircraft, down to the last rivet. When the Spitfire stands on the ground, it looks almost awkward. Its nose is too long, its cockpit too small, and its landing gear track so narrow that the aircraft seems about to tip over. Pilots transitioning from other aircraft were initially nervous during taxiing. The track was so narrow that any unevenness on the runway threatened to make a wingtip strike the ground. But the moment the machine lifted off, everything changed. In the air, the Spitfire was in its element. There, it was not just right, it was exceptional. This was no accident. Every detail of its design was subordinated to a single goal: to fly fast, high, and precisely. Let's start with what is visible immediately: the wing. Viewed from above, the Spitfire's wing resembles the shape of a leaf, or more precisely, an ellipse. It is wide at the root and tapers smoothly to the tips along a curved line, with no straight sections or sudden bends. Most aircraft of the era had either a straight wing, simple to manufacture and predictable in behavior, or a trapezoidal wing, which was aerodynamically slightly better but still a compromise. From the perspective of airflow physics, an elliptical wing operates on a fundamentally different principle. To explain it simply, as a wing moves through the air, it generates lift, but it also creates drag. Part of this drag is called induced drag, which occurs because air flows from the lower surface of the wing to the upper surface at the tips, creating vortices. The more vortices, the greater the loss of speed. An elliptical wing distributes lift along its span as evenly as possible. The vortices at the tips are minimized, and speed losses are kept to a minimum. In practice, this meant the Spitfire lost less speed in level flight than competitors with the same engines. But there was a downside. Such a wing was a manufacturing nightmare. A straight wing can be divided into sections with identical profiles and mass-produced. This was impossible with an elliptical wing because every point of its contour is mathematically unique. Every wing rib and frame had its own curvature. The chief production engineer, upon first seeing the blueprints, asked Mitchell directly, "Are you serious about mass-producing this?" Mitchell replied in the affirmative. The production workers grumbled but got to work, gradually finding methods, special templates and dedicated fixtures to control the curvature. By the time the Spitfire entered mass production, the factory had learned to produce this wing almost as quickly as a straight one. Almost. Next, the fuselage. It was constructed on a principle called semi-monocoque. The term sounds highly technical, but the concept is straightforward. In typical designs of the era, the fuselage relied on an internal framework, like a skeleton, while the outer skin was merely a covering that carried almost no load. In a semi-monocoque design, the skin itself becomes a load-bearing component, working in unison with the internal frame. This allowed for thinner walls and a lighter structure, while achieving greater rigidity and strength than traditional methods. Inside, the fuselage was divided by bulkheads, transverse frames that maintained the shape and distributed loads. There were dozens of them. The engine mount, a welded structure of steel tubes that held the engine, was attached to the fifth bulkhead from the nose. Between the engine and the pilot's cockpit lay a steel firewall, whose task was simple and brutal. If a fire broke out in the engine compartment, it had to buy the pilot precious seconds to abandon the aircraft. Now the skin. There is a detail here that is rarely mentioned. On the nose section of the Spitfire, the skin was attached using flush rivets, meaning the rivet heads were countersunk flat with the surface, leaving no bumps or protrusions. Why was this necessary? At the speeds the Spitfire flew, even a tiny protrusion creates turbulence, which causes drag and a subsequent loss of speed. Calculations showed that flush riveting on the nose section provided a speed increase of about 10 to 15 kilometers per hour compared to standard rivets. 10 to 15 kilometers per hour might seem minor, but in an aerial dogfight, it could mean the difference between catching an opponent and letting them escape. On the rear section, where aerodynamic loads were lower, standard rivets were used. Production was not overcomplicated where it yielded no real advantage. Mitchell was precise only where it made practical sense. The cockpit was cramped, so cramped that a broad-shouldered person could not sit comfortably. The canopy on early models opened by sliding backward. This created a problem. At high speeds, it was almost impossible to open due to air pressure. Pilots knew this but tried not to think about it. The landing gear retracted into the wings, which was no simple task given the wing's shape. The designers devised a mechanism where the landing gear struts pivoted and folded flat inward. Mechanically, it was a clever solution, yielding a clean silhouette in flight with no protruding parts. Altogether, wing, fuselage, skin, landing gear, the aircraft weighed just under 2,000 kilograms in combat trim. That is roughly equivalent to a modern compact car, yet this vehicle flew at speeds approaching 600 kilometers per hour and could withstand G-forces that would cause a pilot to black out. The structure was designed with a margin of safety that permitted aerobatic maneuvers under extreme conditions. Dives, combat turns, Immelmans, the machine withstood all these maneuvers without signs of metal fatigue. Yet, despite its technical sophistication, pilots described the Spitfire as a remarkably docile machine. It was responsive and light on the controls, not temperamental or difficult. It felt as though the plane understood the pilot's intentions before the control stick had even finished moving. This was not magic. It was the result of thousands of hours spent refining the balance, the center of gravity, and the geometry of the control surfaces. Mitchell and his team sought precisely this, to ensure the pilot did not have to fight the machine, allowing them to focus on the combat rather than the aircraft. The airframe was ready. It was time to give it a heart. The Rolls-Royce Merlin is a name known today by anyone with even a passing interest in the aviation of that era. But in 1934, when Mitchell began laying out the Spitfire's design around it, this engine did not yet exist. There was only a project, an idea, a set of calculations on paper. Mitchell made a decision that was highly risky by engineering standards. He began designing the aircraft for an engine that had not yet been built. He designed not for what was available, but for what was to come, trusting the calculations of the Rolls-Royce engineers as he trusted his own. It was a gamble, and it paid off. The Merlin engine was conceived as a project in 1933, underwent its first bench tests in 1935, and was installed in the Spitfire prototype in 1936. Its full designation was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a liquid-cooled V12 engine with a 60-degree cylinder bank. The initial version produced about 1,030 horsepower, roughly equivalent to the engines of 8 modern mid-size cars combined, yet the engine itself weighed around 625 kilograms and fit into an engine bay just over 1.5 meters long. The power density was fantastic for its time. But the main secret of the Merlin was not its displacement or the number of cylinders, it was the supercharger. To explain it simply, a piston engine works by burning a mixture of fuel and air. More air means more powerful combustion and more power. At sea level, the air is dense, and there is plenty of oxygen, but with altitude, the air thins. At an altitude of 5 kilometers, it is roughly half as dense as at sea level. Without additional measures, an engine simply suffocates, losing power precisely when it is needed most. A supercharger solves this problem by forcing air into the cylinders, acting like a pump. The Merlin featured a 2-speed, 2-stage centrifugal supercharger. The key terms here are 2-speed and 2-stage. 2-speed meant the pilot could switch the supercharger's operating mode depending on altitude, a more economical low gear for lower altitudes, and a high gear for maximum air delivery at high altitudes. 2-stage meant the air was compressed sequentially in 2 stages of the supercharger. After the first stage, it was cooled by an intercooler before entering the second stage. This cooling allowed the air to be compressed even further without overheating. As a result, the Merlin maintained high power at altitudes where other engines began to weaken significantly. The engine's cooling system was also unconventional. Instead of plain water, it used a mixture of water and glycol, an antifreeze. This mixture boiled at a higher temperature, allowing the operating temperature of the coolant to be raised and the radiators to be made more compact. Compact radiators meant less aerodynamic drag. The same logic applied. Every element was subordinated to speed. The radiators on the Spitfire were located not in the nose, as on many planes, but under the wings in streamlined fairings. This was another aerodynamic solution, leaving the nose clean while air reached the engine through small intakes on the sides of the cowling. Now, the armament. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The first production Spitfire Mark I variants carried 8 7.69mm Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. With ammunition of 300 rounds per gun and a rate of fire of about 1,150 rounds per minute per gun, all 8 barrels theoretically unleashed over 150 bullets per second. In theory, that is, because reality proved different. In the autumn of 1939, after the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, a pilot was performing a test flight at a high altitude of about 10,000 meters. At this height, the outside temperature drops to -50 degrees Celsius and below. The pilot closed in on the target and pressed the trigger. Only one machine gun fired, and then it too went silent. 7 of the 8 barrels had failed completely. The cause proved to be simple, yet highly problematic. The gun lubricant froze at high altitudes, causing the feed mechanism to stop working. The weapons became useless dead weight precisely where high-altitude air battles occurred. This was reported up the chain of command, and the reaction was swift. The problem had to be solved before major engagements began. Engineers replaced the standard lubricant with a low-temperature alternative and added heating to the armament bays, routing warm air from the engine through special ducts to the wing compartments. The issue was resolved, but the episode demonstrated that the gap between laboratory tests and actual combat conditions could be fatal. Fortunately, this came to light during trials rather than in the heat of battle. In parallel, work proceeded on upgrading the armament. 8 7.69mm machine guns were effective against aircraft with fabric skinning, but by 1940, German machines were all metal. Small caliber bullets sometimes failed to inflict sufficient damage. The answer was the 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon. A 20mm projectile is not a bullet. It is a small shell containing explosive material. A hit from such a shell to an engine or fuel tank meant the end of the flight for any aircraft of the era. The Mark IIB variant began carrying mixed armament, 2 Hispano-Suiza cannons and 4 Browning machine guns. This combination provided both a high rate of fire and the destructive power of heavy shells. But the cannons initially had their own problems. The Hispano-Suiza cannon was developed in France and originally designed to be installed in the engine V, firing through the propeller hub. When engineers attempted to mount it horizontally in the Spitfire's wing, the drum magazine proved too tall. The cannon had to be turned on its side, leaving the drum positioned horizontally. While this solved the clearance problem, it created a new one. With the drum in a horizontal position, cartridges would occasionally feed at an angle, causing jams. Engineers worked on this for several months, redesigning the feed mechanism and modifying the chamber shape until reliability reached an acceptable level. Meanwhile, the Merlin engine continued to evolve. By the end of the Spitfire's production run, in variants powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon, a more powerful descendant of the same engine lineage, output reached 2,070 horsepower, double that of the first Merlin. This was achieved through continuous refinement of the supercharger, the fuel injection system, and the piston group materials. Every new engine version yielded an increase of 50, 100, or sometimes 200 horsepower, immediately translating into a new Spitfire variant with improved performance. The race between aircraft designers and engine designers ran parallel to the real events in the sky, and in this race, the Merlin held its ground. The aircraft was ready, the engine ran, and the weapons fired. It remained only to test everything where there are no second chances. September 6, 1939, 5 days after Britain declared war on Germany. Radars of the British detection system picked up a group of aircraft approaching the east coast of England from the North Sea. An alarm sounded, and standby squadrons scrambled, including Spitfires of No. 74 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. The pilots climbed, intercepted the targets, and opened fire. The problem was that the targets turned out to be British Hurricane fighters from No. 56 Squadron. A false alarm, misidentification, and confusion in the control system led to several friendly aircraft being damaged, and one Hurricane pilot was forced to bail out. This event entered history as the Battle of Barking Creek, named after the village in Essex over which the skirmish occurred. The Spitfire's first combat deployment ended in a friendly fire incident. It was an awkward start, but it taught valuable lessons. The friend or foe identification system was inadequate, and pilots in the heat of interception could mistake any aircraft for the enemy. This lesson was absorbed, and work on identification systems accelerated significantly after the incident. The first months of the war in the West were strange. Historians would later call this period the Phony War. Land combat was virtually non-existent, and the air was relatively quiet. Spitfires patrolled, stood guard, and occasionally intercepted enemy reconnaissance planes. During this period, pilots truly got to know their machines, and their relationship was unique. Pilot Alan Deere, who flew the Spitfire from the early months of its combat service, later wrote in his memoirs that sitting in a Spitfire cockpit felt like putting on a glove. The aircraft did not feel like an external machine. It felt like an extension of one's body. This was not poetry, it was technical reality. Operating the Spitfire required minimal effort. The control stick responded to small movements immediately and precisely, and the rudder pedals were light. Compared to heavier aircraft, pilots remarked that flying it was like steering a thought rather than a mechanism. Yet there were difficulties. Cockpit visibility on early variants left much to be desired. The long engine cowling blocked the view forward during ground taxiing, forcing pilots to move in a zigzag pattern, peering out of one side and then the other. While the canopy provided acceptable visibility in the air, it was not perfect. Pilots adapted, developing a habit of constantly scanning the sky by turning their heads, never flying straight for more than a few seconds, always moving, always looking. The real trials began in May 1940. German forces launched their offensive in the west, striking France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Ground units moved so rapidly that headquarters struggled to track the front line. In the skies above this chaos, air battles unfolded at an intensity and scale unprecedented in aviation history. Spitfires saw limited action over France, as command decided to preserve them for the defense of Britain itself. Their range was barely sufficient, and losing the best machines over foreign territory was deemed unwise. Hurricanes bore the brunt of the fighting in France. But it was here, in the skies of France and Belgium, that Hurricane pilots first encountered the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 in real combat, and they reported findings that command was not eager to hear. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a dangerous adversary. The German fighter possessed one key advantage that initially caught the British off guard. Its engine featured a direct fuel injection system, meaning it continued to run normally during sudden dives. Early versions of the Merlin used a carburetor. Under sudden negative G-forces, such as when the aircraft was pushed abruptly into a dive, the fuel in the carburetor momentarily stopped flowing to the cylinders, causing the engine to sputter for a split second. A split second sounds minor, but when a German pilot pushed his machine into a dive to escape pursuit, a Spitfire could not follow immediately. The engine hesitated, the pursuer lost momentum, and the German escaped. British pilots found a solution on their own without instructions. Before pushing the aircraft into a dive, they performed a half roll. They turned onto their backs and then dived. In the inverted position, the fuel in the carburetor behaved differently, preventing the hesitation. This required skill and took an extra second, but it worked. An engineering solution came later with a modified carburetor incorporating a special valve that prevented fuel starvation during negative G-forces. It was developed by engineer Beatrice Shilling, and her solution was so simple and effective that pilots jokingly referred to it as Miss Shilling's Orifice. Meanwhile, France capitulated. Around 300,000 British and Allied soldiers were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. Air battles raged above the beaches as Spitfires covered the evacuation, encountering the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in full-scale combat for the first time. The conclusions were mixed. At altitudes above 5,000 meters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had a superior rate of climb. Below 5,000 meters, the Spitfire was more maneuverable, almost always winning in horizontal turns. In vertical maneuvers, it depended on altitude and the specific situation. It was neither a victory nor a defeat, but a realization. The two aircraft were closely matched, and the outcome of a battle was decided by the pilot rather than the machine. Pilots returned with reports, command listened, conclusions were drawn, and tactics changed. The summer of 1940 was approaching, and everyone understood that this was only the warm-up. July 1940. France had fallen, and most of continental Europe was under German control. Britain stood alone, not figuratively, but literally alone. The Soviet Union was bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany, and the United States remained officially neutral. The nearest ally, Canada, was thousands of kilometers away across the ocean. Assistance was on the way, but it arrived slowly and was limited to aid rather than active participation. Between Britain and the German troops on the French coast lay 34 kilometers of water, the width of the English Channel at its narrowest point. The German command knew that to transport troops across those 34 kilometers, one condition had to be met: air supremacy. As long as the British Air Force existed, an invasion was impossible. Troop transports would be destroyed from the air before reaching the shore. The objective was set clearly: destroy the Royal Air Force completely and quickly, then launch the invasion. The German command expected to accomplish this in 4 weeks. Let's look at the numbers, which speak louder than any words. By early July 1940, the German Air Force assembled for the strike on Britain numbered about 2,600 combat-ready aircraft. This included roughly 1,000 twin-engine bombers, Heinkel HE-111s, Dornier DO-17s, and Junkers Ju-88s, about 300 Junkers Ju-87s dive bombers, and around 900 fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf-109s, along with twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s. Against them, the Royal Air Force could field about 640 combat-ready fighters, comprising roughly 300 Spitfires and 340 Hurricanes. The ratio was about 4-to-1 in favor of the opponent. Yet the British possessed 3 advantages that these numbers did not reflect. The first was radar. By 1940, Britain featured a network of radar stations stretching along the east and south coasts, known as Chain Home. These stations detected enemy aircraft up to 150 kilometers away, providing about 20 minutes of warning. 20 minutes was enough time for a Spitfire to take off, climb, and intercept. Without radar, fighters would have had to maintain constant standing patrols, which was physically impossible for both machines and pilots. The German command knew about the radar stations and attempted to bomb them, but the high metal antenna masts proved resilient and continued to operate even when damaged. Ground observation posts, where spotters simply scanned the sky and reported by telephone, filled any gaps. The second advantage was territory. All battles occurred over or near Britain. A British pilot shot down over home territory often returned to duty the next day, whereas a downed German pilot became a prisoner of war. For Germany, every lost pilot was gone forever. For Britain, they often were not. The third advantage was the command system. The Royal Air Force had created a highly refined control system. Information from radars and observation posts flowed to a central command filter room. There, operators plotted the situation on large map tables, with specially trained female operators moving markers to track the movement of the air fleets. Commanders saw the complete picture in real time and directed squadrons precisely where they were needed. This was the first real-time air defense management system in history. Captured German pilots remarked, "It seemed the British knew everything about us. Every time we changed course, they were there ahead of us." Because they were. The battle began officially on July 10, 1940, with attacks on British shipping convoys in the English Channel. This was a reconnaissance in force. The German command was testing the reaction of the British defense system and attempting to draw the Royal Air Force into depleting its resources defending shipping. The British reacted cautiously, occasionally letting attacks happen to preserve strength, knowing the main battle lay ahead. The main blow fell in August. On August 13, 1940, a day the German command named Adlertag, Eagle Day, massive strikes were launched against British airfields and aviation infrastructure, with the Luftwaffe flying about 1,500 sorties. Everyone who could fly took to the air. The next 2 weeks were the most difficult. German aviation systematically attacked fighter command airfields in the south of England. Manston was bombed and temporarily put out of action. Hawkin was seriously damaged, and Biggin Hill, a key airfield defending London, was hit 3 times in a single week. After the attacks on Biggin Hill, its runway was cratered, buildings were burned, and casualties among the 300 ground staff numbered dozens dead and wounded. Yet the airfield continued to operate from its damaged runway, using makeshift communications and temporary shelters instead of the destroyed buildings. But by the end of August, the most acute problem was not the aircraft. Planes were being produced. Factories worked constantly, turning out new machines faster than they were shot down. The problem was the pilots. Training a fighter pilot required months for basic preparation, and experienced combat pilots took years to hone their skills. They could not be replaced quickly. By late August, some squadrons had only 7 or 8 combat-ready pilots left instead of the standard 12. Young pilots, fresh from accelerated courses, went into battle with minimal flight hours. Some had never fired their cannons in real conditions before their first actual interception. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, which defended London and the southeast, rarely left his command post. He flew his personal Hurricane to visit the airfields under his charge to assess the situation. His pilots held on, but everyone knew this could not continue indefinitely. And then, the German command made a mistake. On the night of August 24th to 25th, several German bombers drifted off course and accidentally dropped bombs on residential areas of London. In response, British bombers carried out a retaliatory strike on Berlin, bombing the capital of Germany, which official propaganda had declared invulnerable. The German command's reaction was immediate, and from a military standpoint, erroneous. They decided to shift the main weight of their attacks from British airfields to London. This political decision, made in defiance of military logic, gave the Royal Air Force precisely what it desperately needed: time. The airfields ceased to be primary targets. Ground crews repaired runways and buildings, pilots had a few days free from relentless pressure, and the strained command system had an opportunity to recover. Spitfires and Hurricanes now rose to meet the massive German formations heading for London. The bombers flew in tight formations, surrounded by escorting fighters. British tactics had now solidified. Hurricanes attacked the slower, less maneuverable bombers, while Spitfires engaged the escorting fighters to prevent them from protecting the bombers, a division of labor born of real combat experience. Then came September 15th. Sunday, September 15th, 1940, at 6 in the morning. At the No. 11 Group headquarters in Uxbridge, west of London, the duty shift took over on schedule. Operators took their places at the map tables, telephone lines were tested, and communication with the radar stations was normal. Nothing indicated that this day would enter history. Winston Churchill had arrived in London the day before, planning to spend the weekend at his country residence, Chequers, but in the morning, he changed his mind and decided to visit the No. 11 Group bunker to see the system in action. He arrived around 10 in the morning with his wife, Clementine. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park welcomed the Prime Minister and led him to the control room. Churchill stood at the railing of the gallery overlooking the operations room and looked down. On the large map table of southern England, all was quiet. A few markers indicated patrol aircraft, and the operators sat calmly. At 10:08, everything changed. Radar stations on the Kent coast detected a large formation of aircraft over the French shore. The markers on the map began to move, operators spoke into their headsets, and lights on the large wall panels, each representing the status of a squadron, began to illuminate one by one. The first wave of the German raid was forming over French airfields. 21 Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter bombers and 27 Dornier Do-17 bombers, escorted by about 180 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, over 230 machines in a single formation. Park began scrambling his squadrons. He did not send them all at once, which was a common error of inexperienced commanders. Instead, he scrambled them methodically and at intervals to establish several successive interception lines. The first squadrons met the enemy over the sea, the second over the coast, and the third over land. The German armada crossed the coast and headed for London. The bombers flew in tight formation at an altitude of about 6,000 meters, with escorting fighters patrolling above. From a distance, it resembled a vast cloud moving toward the city. The first Spitfires and Hurricanes attacked over Kent. The plan worked as rehearsed. Hurricanes struck the bombers from below in head-on attacks, a dangerous but effective maneuver against bomber formations. A head-on attack provided only seconds of aiming time, but broke up the tight formations, forcing the bombers to maneuver individually and disrupting their coordinated defense. Meanwhile, Spitfires engaged the Messerschmitt Bf-109s. At altitudes of 6,000 to 7,000 meters in the cold autumn sky over Kent, several simultaneous dogfights took place. Each lasted seconds: an attack, an evasive maneuver, then another attack. Pilots saw the world through narrow sectors in their sights, hearing only the roar of the engine and bursts of fire. The first German wave pressed through to London, dropping bombs on the docks in the east of the city and on railway junctions. Around 11:30, the first wave turned back. In the Uxbridge bunker, a tense calm prevailed. Churchill looked at the map. The markers representing German aircraft slowly retreated toward the sea, while British squadrons returned to their airfields. Park stood nearby, calm and focused. Churchill asked, "What other reserves have we?" Park looked at the panel of lights. Almost all were lit, indicating that nearly every squadron was either in the air or had just returned to refuel. "There are none, sir," Park replied. Churchill fell silent. He would later write in his memoirs that this was one of the most tense moments of his life. All cards had been played, there were no reserves, and it was unknown if a second wave would follow. It did. At 1400, radars detected a new formation, this time significantly larger. 114 bombers, Dornier Do-17s and Heinkel He-111s, flew in several echelons, protected by about 450 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters and dozens of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s, nearly 600 aircraft in a single force. Park scrambled every squadron he could and requested reinforcements from the neighboring No. 12 Group, which defended the Midlands. No. 12 Group sent its Big Wing, a formation of 5 squadrons flying together. In total, the British put about 310 fighters into the air that day, 218 Hurricanes and 92 Spitfire Mark Is. They flew to meet 600. What occurred over London and Kent over the next 40 minutes was one of the largest air battles in history. Hundreds of aircraft fought simultaneously in the sky above one of the world's largest cities. Burning machines crashed into the suburbs, and parachutes opened over residential streets as Londoners watched the battle unfold among the white contrails. The German bombers reached London and dropped their payloads, but their formation had been disrupted by attacks starting over the sea, reducing their bombing accuracy. Bombs fell haphazardly instead of on strategic targets. On their return route, the German formations faced another attack from British squadrons that had refueled after the first battle. By 1530, the second wave retreated. The outcome of the day, the British lost 29 aircraft, 21 Hurricanes and 8 Spitfires. 14 British pilots were killed and several others were wounded. The German side lost 55 aircraft destroyed, with even more damaged and put out of action for several days, and many experienced crews were captured over British territory. The loss ratio was nearly 2-to-1 in favor of the British. More importantly, the German Air Force failed to achieve its objective. London was bombed, but the strategic goals that might have broken British resistance were not met. Critically, the Royal Air Force was not defeated. They fought on. The German command had expected British fighter forces to be near exhaustion, yet they encountered the same Spitfires and Hurricanes in the same numbers and with the same intensity. The calculations did not add up. On September 17, 1940, 2 days after this engagement, Germany's High Command announced the postponement of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The postponement proved indefinite, and the invasion never took place. September 15th is now officially commemorated in the United Kingdom as Battle of Britain Day. Every year, an aerial parade passes over London, and Spitfires always fly in it, operational machines powered by Merlin engines, making the same sound as in 1940. War is a powerful catalyst for technological progress, forcing engineers to work faster than they would in decades of peacetime. Every new threat in the air brought a new requirement, and every requirement led to a new modification. Over its production life, the Spitfire underwent a transformation that would have taken half a century in peacetime. Let's start from the beginning. The Mark I, which fought in the Battle of Britain, was excellent for its time, featuring a Merlin 2 or 3 engine producing about 1,030 horsepower, 8 machine guns, and a top speed of roughly 580 kilometers per hour at 5,000 meters. But while it fought, the adversary did not stand still. The German Focke-Wulf FW-190 appeared over the English Channel in September 1941 and immediately created a serious problem. It was faster than the Spitfire Mark V, which had become the primary fighter of the Royal Air Force. It was faster at sea level, faster at medium altitudes, better in a dive, and superior in high-speed turns. Initial encounters produced troubling statistics, with pilots reporting that the Focke-Wulf could disengage at will, and catching it in a Mark V was nearly impossible. The response from British designers was swift. Engineer Joseph Smith, who led the design team after Mitchell's death, took a pragmatic approach. Instead of developing a completely new aircraft, he took the Spitfire airframe and fitted it with a significantly more powerful engine, the Merlin 61, with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, producing 1,565 horsepower, 500 horsepower more than the Mark I. The difference was immediate. The new variant, the Spitfire Mark IX, entered service in mid-1942. Pilots transitioning from the Mark V described the sensation as feeling a sudden push in the back. The top speed rose to 657 kilometers per hour, the rate of climb improved significantly, and the service ceiling reached about 13,000 meters. The Focke-Wulf FW190 was no longer out of reach. The Mark IX became the most heavily produced Spitfire variant, with over 5,000 built, serving in all theaters of war, over North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe after the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944. In parallel, work proceeded on specialized versions, notably photo reconnaissance aircraft. By 1940, it was clear that reconnaissance missions over enemy territory required speed and high altitude to avoid interception. Photographic reconnaissance Spitfires were stripped of all armament, removing cannons and machine guns to accommodate cameras and extra fuel tanks. Without heavy armament, the aircraft became significantly lighter, climbed better, and flew faster. An early photo reconnaissance version, the Spitfire PR Mark IV, appeared in 1940, carrying two cameras in the rear fuselage and extra fuel tanks in the wing leading edges, extending its range enough to fly to Norway and back. By the end of the conflict, high-altitude reconnaissance variants operated at altitudes exceeding 13,000 meters, where temperatures dropped below -60 degrees. Pilots wore specialized high-altitude suits and breathed oxygen through masks. The cockpits were not fully pressurized, meaning pilots worked in conditions that pushed the human body to its limits. It was one such reconnaissance aircraft that participated in the highest altitude air engagement over Britain. In August 1942, a German high-altitude bomber, the Junkers Ju-86, a specialized variant with a pressurized cabin and highly supercharged engines, began appearing over Britain at altitudes beyond the reach of standard interceptors. Flying above 11,000 meters, these machines were considered virtually invulnerable. Pilot Flying Officer Emanuel Galitzine was given a specially prepared Spitfire Mark V with a lightened structure, a modified engine, and extended wingtips to provide better lift in the thin air of high altitudes. On September 12, 1942, Galitzine scrambled to intercept. He climbed slowly as the engine operated at its limit and the cockpit grew so cold that movement became difficult. He caught the Junkers at an altitude of about 11,000 meters and pressed the trigger. The cannons fired a few bursts and then jammed, their mechanisms freezing in the cold. Galitzine closed in and fired his remaining machine gun ammunition almost point blank. The Junkers sustained damage and retreated to the continent, never to return, its mission uncompleted. This was the highest altitude air battle of the Battle of Britain era. Then there is the story of the flying bombs. In the summer of 1944, Germany began using a weapon against which conventional interception tactics did not work: the Fiesler Fi-103 flying bomb, known to the British as the V-1, from the German Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon 1. This was a small, pilotless, pulse-jet-powered aircraft carrying an 800-kilogram warhead, flying at speeds of about 640 kilometers per hour at altitudes between 1 and 3,000 meters. Intercepting it with cannon fire was difficult due to its speed. Most fighters could barely catch it, making aiming from a short distance extremely difficult. Furthermore, the detonation of the warhead could destroy the intercepting aircraft if it opened fire too close. The Spitfire Mark XIV, powered by a 2,050 horsepower Rolls-Royce Griffon 65 engine, could reach 720 kilometers per hour at low altitude, making it faster than the V-1. However, pilots devised an alternative to shooting. They approached the flying bomb closely, within a few meters, and placed their wingtip under the wing of the missile. A slight touch or even the air disturbance from the fighter's wingtip overturned the unstable pilotless craft, causing it to lose control and crash in unpopulated areas before reaching its target, all without firing a single shot. This maneuver, known as wing tipping, required exceptional piloting precision to approach an object flying at 640 kilometers per hour within meters and hold position. A single miscalculation meant a collision. The Spitfire Mark 14 destroyed about 300 V-1 flying bombs using this method and conventional cannon fire, out of approximately 10,000 launched against Britain, 300 explosions that did not occur in residential neighborhoods. By the end of active hostilities, the Spitfire had evolved from the 1,000 horsepower Mark 1 to the Mark 24, powered by a Griffin engine producing 2,350 horsepower. Top speed rose from 580 to 740 kilometers per hour, and armament increased from 8 machine guns to 2 cannons and 4 machine guns, or in some versions 4 20mm cannons. There were 24 major variants over 10 years. It was the same basic aircraft, yet by the end it possessed nearly double the power, significantly greater speed, and entirely different capabilities than at the beginning. It was an adaptable design that grew alongside the war, supported by thousands of people not just in the cockpits, but in the factories. Their story is equally remarkable. September 26, 1940, Southampton, 1:30 in the afternoon. German Heinkel He-111 bombers appeared over the city. 59 machines flew in tight formation at an altitude of about 5,000 meters. Their target was neither a residential quarter nor the port. It was the Supermarine factory. This was the very factory where Reginald Mitchell had sat at his drawing board, where the first prototype was created, and where Spitfires now stood in assembly bays at various stages of completion. Bombs fell for about 20 minutes. When it ended, the main production building was completely destroyed. Auxiliary buildings were seriously damaged, some equipment was ruined, and there were casualties among the workers. Production of the Spitfire ground to a halt. In Berlin, this appeared to be a success. The main factory producing Britain's premier fighter was destroyed, and they only had to wait for the supply of completed machines to run out. But they did not account for one man. His name was Herbert Pratt. He was the production manager at Supermarine, a man without a military background or high titles, but an exceptional organizer. That evening, while firefighters were still pouring water on the smoking ruins, Pratt began making calls. His plan was simple yet entirely unconventional for the industrial thinking of the era. If the factory was destroyed, they must produce without a factory. Pratt began driving around the outskirts of Southampton and Winchester, searching for spaces. Any spaces with a flat floor, sufficient ceiling height, and good access roads. A bus depot in Shirley, suitable. A garage in Titchfield, suitable. A warehouse in Itchen, suitable. School workshops in several towns, suitable with minor adjustments. A vacant wing of a local hospital, with some imagination, also suitable. Within a few weeks, Spitfire production was dispersed across approximately 50 different locations within a radius of a few dozen kilometers from Southampton. Logistics became an art in itself. Fuselage sections were made in one location, wings assembled in another, and engines installed in a third. Completed aircraft were transported along roads on specialized low-loader trailers, disassembled, with wings detached, to the nearest airfields, where final assembly and test flights were performed. Strange processions began appearing on the roads of Hampshire and Wiltshire. A Spitfire fuselage on one truck, wings on another, accompanied by a police escort, while ordinary people on the sidewalk stopped to watch, some removing their hats. Production rates did not fall. In fact, dispersed production proved more resilient than a single factory. If one of the 50 workshops was damaged or halted, the other 49 continued to operate. German bombers could no longer halt production with a single raid. There is another story often told only in passing, the story of who built these aircraft. By 1941, a significant portion of the workforce producing Spitfires consisted of women, as the men had gone to fight. Those who remained stepped forward to work in the factories and dispersed workshops. Women riveted fuselages, assembled wings, installed electrical systems, and worked with precision measuring instruments on engine parts. Most of them had never worked in manufacturing before, coming from jobs as shop assistants, secretaries, and teachers. After brief training, they took their places at the machines. One of them, Florence Green of Birmingham, later recalled fearing during her first week that she would make a mistake, that if she got a dimension wrong or set a rivet poorly, a plane would crash, and that a life depended on her hands. This responsibility was not a burden, it brought them together. You don't think about being tired, she said, you think about making sure this plane returns. The quality of the work did not suffer with the change in workforce. Inspectors noted this in reports. The new workers were often more meticulous and precise than veterans accustomed to repetitive assembly line work, as they retained a high level of attention to detail. Now, regarding the finances, which present another surprising chapter. In 1939, a single Spitfire cost £12,604 sterling, a vast sum at the time, roughly equivalent to the price of a small house in the suburbs of London. While the state paid for the aircraft from the war budget, in 1940, after the Battle of Britain, local Spitfire funds began to emerge spontaneously across the country. Towns, districts, businesses, and individuals began raising money for specific aircraft rather than a general war fund. Every aircraft purchased with donated money received a name chosen by the donors. The city of Coventry, devastated by German bombing in November 1940, raised funds for several machines, which were named after streets destroyed in the raid. India donated funds for a squadron of Spitfires, and Australia financed several squadrons. Money arrived from Canada, South Africa, and private donors worldwide. Children in British schools contributed their pocket money, a few pence at a time. While these pence did not resolve the issue of financing, they represented a shared effort. Everyone who gave felt that the aircraft belonged partly to them. In total, 20,351 Spitfires of all variants were produced, along with an additional 2,408 naval Seafires adapted for aircraft carrier operations. Over 22,000 machines, each passing through many hands, from the designer's drawing board to the factory worker, the assembler, the test pilot, and the combat pilot. They worked toward a common goal, and the aircraft outlived them all. On June 9, 1961, the last Spitfire in active military service with the Irish Air Corps completed its final operational patrol and taxied to a halt. The Merlin engine fell silent, and the pilot climbed out of the cockpit. 25 years had passed since the prototype's first flight. In those 25 years, the world had changed beyond recognition. Jet fighters had long since replaced piston engine machines, and speeds and altitudes had doubled or tripled. The very nature of aerial combat had changed. Technically, the Spitfire was obsolete, yet something in it remained alive. After active hostilities ended in 1945, the aircraft did not disappear immediately. It continued to fly for another decade and a half in the armed forces of many nations. India received Spitfires and deployed them during the first conflict with Pakistan in 1947 to 1948. Israel used them in its War of Independence in 1948, operating on both sides of the conflict, a historical curiosity. Czechoslovakia, Egypt, Poland, Thailand, Turkey, Norway, and Greece. The list of countries where the Spitfire flew after the war is extensive. Its final combat deployments occurred in the early 1950s. An aircraft designed by a dying engineer in the mid-1930s fought in conflicts of the following decade, long after the war for which it was created had ended. This in itself speaks to the quality of the design. Today, about 240 Spitfires survive worldwide. Most reside in museums, preserved on pedestals or in static displays, where visitors can walk around them, view them from any angle, and read about their history. Yet approximately 60 of them still fly. This number fluctuates as restorations are completed and occasional landing incidents occur, but the figure remains stable. Several dozen Spitfires around the world are in airworthy condition and regularly take to the sky. It is remarkable that an aircraft over 80 years old is still flying, not merely as a static display, but actively, with its original engines and configuration. The mechanics who maintain them know every bolt, much like a doctor knows a patient with a long medical history. Spare parts for the Merlin engine are no longer mass-produced. They are manufactured to original drawings by small, specialized firms, or recovered from depots where they lay for 70 years in grease and oiled paper. One mechanic at the Duxford base, which houses the Imperial War Museum's collection of airworthy Spitfires, noted in an interview that when you dismantle a Merlin engine, you see how it was made. Every component was crafted with such a margin of safety and attention to detail, as if the person machining it knew it would have to work for a very long time, as if they were building not just for a war, but for the ages. The sound is another matter. The Merlin engine has a distinctive sound that is impossible to mistake, a deep, powerful growl with a slight edge at high RPMs. People who heard it over London in 1940 described it as the sound of hope. When German bombers approached, the sound was different, heavy, ominous, and steady. Then, from above or from the flank, another sound would break in, higher and more vibrant, and people below knew their defenders had arrived. This sound can still be heard today. Every year in September, an aerial parade takes place over London to commemorate Battle of Britain Day, featuring surviving airworthy Spitfires and Hurricanes flying low over the city, their engine noise audible for miles. People gather on the streets, look up, and record the moment on their phones, while some simply stand and listen. Among them were once very elderly people, those who remembered this sound not from recordings or museums, but from their childhood in 1940, when it meant someone was flying to protect them at that very moment. Reginald Mitchell did not live to see this. He passed away in 1937, a year after his aircraft's first flight and 3 years before its major battles. He did not see his machine fight over the English Channel, nor did he hear pilots remark that it responded to their thoughts. He never knew that the wing he designed would still slice through the air more than 80 years after his passing. Yet, in some way, he must have foreseen it all. Why else would he have hurried so? Why else did he go to the factory with a fever, or continue drafting when the pain made it difficult to hold a pencil? Why else did he believe in an engine that did not yet exist, and a wing that everyone else considered impractical? Mitchell built an aircraft designed to outlast the threat, the war, and time itself, and he succeeded. Today, when a silhouette with that characteristic elliptical wing appears over any city, and the sound of the Merlin engine is heard, people look up. They do so not because it requires effort or specialized knowledge, but because there is something in that silhouette that moves even those who know nothing of its history. A beauty that does not age, an idea expressed in metal so precisely and fully that the passing decades have not dimmed it. One dying engineer, one blank sheet of paper, and an aircraft that changed the outcome of one of the most significant confrontations of the 20th century, the Spitfire.